this better, or let's look at this phrase. But what exactly is a phrase? And we do have an actual definition for it. And it's a unit of musical thought that ends with a cadence. So phrases are usually 2, 4, or 8 bars in length. This isn't always the case, especially nowadays, but in the classical era, most of them were 2, 4, or 8 bars. So that'll help us to find different phrases. So the first type of phrase that I actually want to talk to you about is known as the sentence. And this name was applied later. It didn't have this name originally, but this type of phrase occurred so much in the classical era that theorists, many centuries later, decided to call it the sentence. Let's listen first, before I talk about it, let's listen to an example of a sentence. And this is Beethoven's Sonatina in F. Okay, so what exactly makes this a sentence? Well, the first sort of thing about sentences is they're often in a 1 + 1 + 2 structure. So if we think about that in terms of measures, that's either 1 + 1 + 2 measures, or in this case, 2 + 2 + 4. So if we look at the first 2 bars, we have a motive that's stated. And if we look at the next 2 bars, we have that same motive that's stated up a step. So 2 + 2, and then the final 4 bars giving us that last section. So this first sort of 4 bars, this pair of 2s, where the motive is stated and then restated, either at variation or transposition, in this case a transposition up a step, is called the presentation phase. So these first 4 bars are known as the presentation phase, and the last 4 are known as the continuation phase. So let's listen to it again, now that we kind of know the nuts and bolts of sentences. So, like I was saying, in the presentation phase, it's the motive, and then it's the motive again here at transposition. In the continuation phase, it isn't exact statement of the motive, but it does retain the same rhythm and the same articulation. Another, and I apologize, we're going to be going through a lot of phrases, so keep with me. Another type of phrase that you're going to run into a lot is known as the period. And I'm sure you've heard this term before. Period is when we actually put 2 phrases together. So the first phrase in a period will end with a weaker cadence, usually a half cadence or an imperfect authentic cadence. And the second will end with a stronger cadence, which is usually a perfect authentic cadence. So let's listen to an example of a period. And it's a folk song from Stephen Foster. It's "Oh, Susanna." So you'll hear the first phrase will end with this half cadence, and the second phrase will end with a perfect authentic cadence. Okay, so that's an example of a period. Now there are 2 separate types of periods, or 2 separate main types of periods. And the first one I want to talk about is parallel. So parallel periods, both of the phrases begin in the same way. So after you have the first phrase ending, then if it's parallel, the second phrase will begin just like the first. Can somebody tell me, is "Oh, Susanna" a parallel phrase, yes or no? Does the second phrase, I'm sorry, a parallel period, does the second phrase start in the same way as the first phrase? No. Well, if we look, here's the end of the first phrase, right? It ends on this half cadence. So does the second phrase begin just like the first?
Yeah, it's parallel.
Yeah. Right, so it's parallel, exactly. Okay. Now, you may have guessed that the other type of period is known as contrasting. And the difference is that the second phrase begins differently than the first. So let's look at a contrasting period. And this is Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. Yeah, so you should have heard here at the second phrase after this first cadence, it starts quite a bit differently than the first. So you know, we can talk about periods, but there's actually ways that we can show them visually, and that's through a phrase diagram. So I actually want to look back at Susanna at the phrase diagram. Um, in total, it's just going to show a visual layout of the period. So we can see here the example is in total 8 bars long, and it's dividing those 8 bars into the 2 phrases. We have the first phrase and the second phrase, and the first phrase is going to be notated as A, but since the second phrase is similar, and because it's a parallel period, we'll call that A prime. And we can show the key, of course, as D major, and the first phrase ending with the half cadence and the second with a perfect authentic cadence. And if we look at a phrase diagram for a contrasting period, it's almost the same, except the second phrase is not going to be A prime because it's contrasting. So it's going to be the first phrase as A and the second phrase as B. Do you have any questions about parallel and contrasting? I feel like I may have gone through that pretty quickly. Any questions? Great. So let's look at some other types of periods. We don't have just parallel and contrasting. Another type of period is known as the modulating period. So the ones we've looked at now, the 2 examples we've looked at have been in the same key the entire time. There was no change of key, but you can have periods that change key somewhere within them. So that's known as a modulating period. Usually it's going to be in the second phrase, but not always. So let's listen to an example of a modulating period. You can see we start in 1 key, and listen for the key change in the second phrase. Yeah, so you can hear that we clearly went to G major. You can see it because of the accidentals, and you can also hear it. And also, when we talk about periods, the first phrase, if you want to be a little more specific, the first phrase in a period is known as the antecedent, and the second phrase is known as the consequent. And if you're talking about a modulating period, that's the antecedent and the modulating consequent. Not all periods are 2 phrases. Some can be 3 and 4 phrases, actually. So if you have one that consists of 3 phrases, it's exactly the same as a 2-phrase period, in that the first phrase ends with a weaker cadence, the second phrase ends with a weaker cadence, and finally, you get that strong cadence at the end of the 3rd phrase. So let's listen to an example of a 3-phrase period. Yeah, so you can clearly hear that these 3 phrases belong together. And you can see the first one ends with that half cadence, and then another half cadence, and finally we get our perfect authentic cadence. So you can have periods in 3 phrases. You can also have periods in 4 phrases. And we don't call it a quadruple period. For some reason, we call it a double period. So let's listen. It's the same concept. You have the first phrase ending with a weaker cadence, in this case, an imperfect authentic cadence. Then that second phrase, and then half cadence, then another imperfect authentic cadence, and finally the perfect authentic cadence. So let's listen to this 4-phrase period known as a double period. Okay, so you can clear that those 4 sections obviously belong together, and the idea about the phrases before, in this case, the first, second, and third, ending with a weaker cadence, and finally with the perfect authentic cadence, that holds true whether it's 2 phrases, 3 phrases, or 4 phrases. All right, so I think I've talked a lot, so let's actually engage our brains here. Hopefully I can click on a tab that this silly Zoom stuff is in the way. Here we go. Okay, so let's actually try to identify periods ourselves. So we can look at this for a second, but I want to listen to it first, because listening to it, I think even more than looking at it, you can hear where the phrases lie. So let's listen to this, just the first 16 bars. Okay, and it repeats. So I think we can all agree that we heard a resting point here at the end of the 8th bar. But before we talk about that, can anybody tell me what key are we in? And the title may give it away. Sometimes when they put a key signature in a title, it is the key, but sometimes it's not. So can somebody tell me what key are we in?
We'll go with G major.
Huh?
G major.
You major.
Yeah. Right, we're definitely in the key of G. So I think we all agree we're in the key of G. So if we look at this resting place, this cadence in the 8th bar, what chord is this in the key of G?
5 chord.
Sorry?
5 chord?
Off chord.
Yeah, right. 5/7, right? Since we have this C. So, right. So 5/7, which is a half cadence. And then here at the end, obviously, is a stronger resting place, a stronger cadence. What chord is this in the key of G? Did somebody say it?
The 1.
Yeah, right. 1 chord. So if we think about that, we're in the key of G, we're ending with a half cadence here, and we're ending with a perfect authentic cadence here. We have 2 phrases, 8 bars in length. What kind of period is this? Is it parallel or contrasting?
Parallel.
Right, parallel, right? Because after the first cadence, the second phrase starts exactly as the first. So we are a parallel period. So if we go back here, if I can click on it. No, I can't click on it. This little Zoom taskbar's in the way. That's fine. So it is a parallel period. Is anybody noticing something about the phrases themselves? Let's listen again to just the first phrase. That phrase is actually something we talked about earlier. Does anybody recognize it?
Transposed.
It's a sentence, right? It's a sentence, exactly. Because we have this motive statement here. We have the motive stated again, a step up, and then he's retaining the rhythm in the subsequent 4 bars, right? So we actually have 2 sentences making up a period. So let's look at this phrase diagram. If I can click on the right one, it's this one, okay? So like we said, it is parallel, and this is actually the phrase diagram. The first phrase being 8 bars, we label that as A, and since it's parallel, the second 8 bars would be A prime. But we can actually notate the sentence within the 8 bars, so the 2 plus 2 plus 4, and then the 2 plus 2 plus 4. Okay, let's look at another one. If I can get it. So you can actually see the score. We're just listening to the first 8 bars. Okay, let's listen to that one more time. And it repeated, so I could have just let it go. Let's listen to it one more time. Okay. So where is the first cadence? Where is the first cadence that was obviously heard in these first 8 measures?
Measure 4.
Right, measure 4. On what beat of measure 4? The second beat, right?
Second.
So what key are we in?
Flat.
B flat.
Right, B flat. So if we look at the second beat of measure 4, what chord is this in the key of B flat?
That's the F.
Right, so another 5/7, right? So we have a half cadence here in measure 4, and we heard another cadence here in bar 8, and if we look, that is B flat major, okay? So when we look at this first cadence, which we said is a half cadence, if we look at the start of the second phrase, is it the same or different than the start of the first phrase?
Different.
Yeah, it's different. So this is definitely a contrasting period. So if we look at the phrase diagram for this, it's contrasting. Again, we have A, but instead of A prime, we're going to have B because the second phrase is different than the first. We have that half cadence in measure 4 and ending with a perfect authentic cadence. So hopefully, I feel like I was on the fast mode here, but hopefully some of that stuck with you. I hope maybe it cleared up some of these different phrase types, and I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kyle. Let's see. And then unshare your screen, Kyle, if you don't mind. Perfect. And then let's have it, Trevor. Let's have you go next, I think, because your subject is following his.
Okay, we can do that. All right. Let me make sure everything is working real quick. Does everybody have my screen? Let me do this.
Okay, go ahead and share it. All right, here it comes. Yep, we see it.
Got it. Okay.